So the first principle I'm going to jump into is the principle of majority rule, but minority rights. So in the Articles of Confederation, and we've talked about these before, this is the quote unquote constitution that governed the Continental Congress during the American Revolution. Prior to the American Revolution, there were 13 independent colonies with each their own separate form of government, and there was no unifying force. Well, the Articles of Confederation were the first attempt by the early colonies to band together and have some kind of a central coordinating force to help get them through the American Revolution to manage that war. But one of the main limiting factors of the Articles of Confederation was that it required unanimity. Now, for those who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, unanimity is something we're fairly familiar with. The Quorum of the 12 Apostles and the First Presidency don't move forward on a decision unless there is unanimous consensus. So that doesn't seem like it would be that big of a deal. Well, yeah, unanimity. We shouldn't move forward until everybody agrees. However, in the history of governments, of civil societies, unanimity is not something that is practical. It's a nice thought and is ideal, but those countries and those governments that have tried it have just been met with all kinds of problems in real life application. In particular, waiting on unanimity can be disastrous in a time of emergency, like what we had during the American Revolution. If there's a major problem that needs to be solved now, waiting and trying to get a complete 100% consensus on what to do about it can be costly. And in the meantime, while you're trying to get everyone onto your side, people could be dying or starving or worse. John Locke, who was one of the philosophers that the founding fathers relied on heavily in framing the Constitution, said, "And thus every man, by consenting with others to make one body politic under one government, puts himself under an obligation to everyone of that society to submit to the determination of the majority and to be concluded or bound by it." So in other words, when we choose to live in a society, and we all, because we're still here, if we're in the United States, we have agreed to live under this government. So what that means is we're agreeing to bind ourselves by the will of the majority, even if what the majority wants doesn't agree with what I want. And this principle, aside from being just a practical way to run government, is key to how in this country we have had peaceful transitions of power over and over and over again. If you look at world history, when power passes from one person to another, even in many cases when it passes from father to son, from a king to a prince, many times those transitions are fraught with turbulence. In fact, the very first time that we had a transition of power from George Washington to John Adams, the founding fathers waited with held breath to see what would happen. When George Washington was elected, he was almost universally loved and adored and respected. So he was an easy first pick for the first president of the United States. By the time he had served 2 terms and it was John Adams' turn, he was not the universally adored figure that George Washington was. So many of the founders wondered, what are the people who don't like John Adams, who didn't vote for him? What are they going to do when he takes over? And many of them expected revolts and violence because based on the history of the world that they knew to that point, the vast majority of the time when there's a transition of power, that's what happens. And even more so, John Adams was a part of the same political party as George Washington. So maybe there wasn't as much trepidation with that one, but after John Adams, when Thomas Jefferson came in, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, this wasn't just a shift from one person to another. It was a shift from one political party to another. And again, everyone was nervous. What are people going to do? What are the Federalists going to do now that we have this anti-Federalist and Thomas Jefferson taking over? Are they going to revolt? Are they going to rebel? Are we going to have another revolution? And it didn't happen. So as this continued time after time, it became a little bit more common to expect that when we pass the baton from one leader to another in the United States of America, at least, we're going to do that peacefully. And so that has become in this country the rule rather than the exception. Whereas in all of prior human history, peaceful transitions of power was not the rule. It was the exception. Now, we do have some exceptions of that in America, the most notable one being when Abraham Lincoln was elected. The minority of the states who didn't like Abraham Lincoln's philosophies with regards to slavery broke away, declared their independence, and tried to secede from the nation. They weren't willing to follow this principle and allow the will of the majority to be what we all agreed to. They violated that principle. And I know I talked about the Civil War before, but this is yet another principle that they were in violation of that put them on the wrong side of God and put them on the wrong side of history. John Locke also said, "For if the consent of the majority shall not in reason be received as the act of the whole, nothing but the consent of every individual can make anything to be the act of the whole, which considering the variety of opinions and contrariety of interests which unavoidably happen in all collections of man, it is next to impossible ever to be had." So this is a little wordy, but he's basically saying that if the majority isn't good enough to be received as if it were the act of the whole, then nothing short of the agreement of every single individual works. Nothing less than that works. So you either have to have majority or unanimity. There really isn't a great in-between place. And Alexander Hamilton in Federalist paper number 22 explained this a little bit more why that is. He said, "To give a minority a negative upon the majority is in its tendencies to subject the sense of the greater number to that of the lesser number. The necessity of unanimity in public bodies, or something that approaches towards it, has been founded upon a supposition that it would contribute to security. But its real operation is to substitute the pleasure, caprice, or artifices of an insignificant, turbulent, or corrupt junto to the regular deliberations and decisions of a respectable majority." So he's saying here that in the past, people have considered requiring unanimity to contribute to security, right? We're not going to make any movement forward if we can't get everybody to agree. And in principle, he's agreeing that sounds great. The reason why we've been doing that is because we think that's going to grant us greater security, but it doesn't in practice, because what ends up happening, and they saw this in practice during the Revolutionary War, you end up with a small majority that can stop and bring everything to a grinding halt. So Rhode Island was a common culprit of this during the American Revolution. Rhode Island was the smallest state. It felt its impotence a little bit, and it would flex its muscle when it had a chance. So if there was something it didn't like, it would just stall everybody up. You could have 12 of the 13 colonies all wanting to do the same thing, but because Rhode Island held out, they were stuck. There was nothing that they could do. So by trying to bring about unanimity, you end up with the situation where the minority can call all the shots. And in a world where we have to choose either between the majority's will being what flies, or everybody being ruled by a minority or by a smaller group of people, the lesser of those two evils is the rule by the majority. So nothing short of majority rule, if you try to make it unanimous, then you are automatically accepting rule by the minority, is what that means. Now, you may hear that and say, well, if the minority's will isn't what gets to take precedence, then the rights of minorities must surely be trampled. And In a lot of cases, you would be right. That's one of the big reasons why many of the founding fathers saw the implementation of a Bill of Rights as absolutely essential, and why they saw the importance of a written constitution as vital. Because throughout history, anytime democracy had been put in practice, inevitably the majority would band together and oppress the minority, oppress the few. And we've talked about this before. If you can get 51% of the people to agree that 49% of the people should give all their property to us, then they can enact that law. So a couple of things that the founding fathers put in place allow for the majority to take precedence, which is just practical for good government, while also protecting the rights of the minority. And the Constitution is that first line of defense. There is a set of rules that even if the majority comes together and wants to do something different, they cannot. They cannot come together and do something that goes against the Constitution. So that's one way that those rights are protected. And the second way is really kind of part and parcel with the first one, and that is the inclusion of a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Because there are certain rights that are listed, those rights cannot be violated, even if you have a majority that wants to violate them. And this is one of the main reasons why, in order to alter the Constitution, you have to have the agreement of 75% of the states. They didn't make the altering of the Constitution subject to the will of a simple bare majority of 51%. They made it subject to 3/4 of all people. So in order to change those rules, in order to change those rights, if there were a majority that wanted to come and oppress the minority, they would have to get 3/4 of the population of the United States, or 3/4 of the states, sorry, not the population, but 3/4 of the states to agree with them. And then they could alter the Constitution in a way that eliminates some of those guardrails that are meant to keep the minority safe. But in practice, that is very difficult to do, especially where, as John Locke puts it, that there are a variety of opinions and contrariative interests which unavoidably happen in all collections of men. So interests are so varied and divided and different that to get that many of the states to agree to a change really is a lot harder than you would think it is. Really is a lot harder.